why do you get this kind of idea of Jews as the money takers and the money spinners? When you dismiss the discussions, you get the conspiracy theorists, and you can breed the anti-Semitism. Oh, how did I grow up? Interesting first question. I grew up in Melbourne, in a kind of distinctively, I suppose, middle-class family. I have 2 siblings. We were Jewish, so I went to particularly observant. I went to an Anglican school in Melbourne, where I got educated. I was quite nerdy. I did a lot of tech and media and IT things at school, and then went on to university in Melbourne.
And when did you become interested in politics or free market philosophy, or how would you describe what you're interested in?
Yeah, definitely interested in politics, definitely interested in kind of philosophy, free market philosophy, economics. It definitely did come when I was growing up. I had this, I grew up kind of very much, probably in a similar period to you, with amongst the latter years of the Herald government, was all this time of kind of relative economic prosperity. I have these memories of kind of my father sitting down to watch it must have been some of Peter Costello's later budgets as they were announcing tax cuts. He would always say he ran a small business, kind of a medium-sized business. He'd always be very happy that the government in this kind of boom economic period is able to cut taxes, return more money to people, and that was something from the early days. I thought, he's hardworking, he's creating something, he's employing people, and I got this kind of broad sense that the government wasn't an enabler of that, but the government often got in the way. So the government often got in the way, with payroll taxes that were too high, or additional workplace regulations, all these different issues that would come up as problems within that. And then a little bit later, I suppose I think probably came on YouTube. I don't quite know how I found it, but came across some kind of more philosophical discussions about politics and economics, and in particular Milton Friedman, who does these great kind of free to choose documentaries on which you can find. He did with PBS in the US in the 80s, and then also had an associated book that's kind of a very easy introduction to free market ideas, and I was probably about hooked from the age of 15 or 16, and thought this is how the world should run. That people should be as free as possible to make decisions within their own lives, be it in their social lives, with who they want to love or spend their time with or associate with, or alternatively in their economic lives as well. That people should be free to exchange resources and trade with each other in the process. They're going to make themselves better off. And not that there isn't necessarily no role for government. In fact, Milton Friedman is not a kind of anarchist in any way. He was very much someone who allocated some kind of redistributive welfare state, who said that there should be public support for education, or that should be through vouchers, so people can choose their own schools. So kind of a minimal role for state, or lesser role for state, and a more role for individuals to be free to associate and better themselves.
Was YouTube even a thing when you were 15?
It must have been you're right, it must have been in the early days of YouTube. I'm not that old, I'm only 29. I think YouTube was established in 2004, 2005, I think.
Okay.
So it was probably early YouTube. It's probably before the annoying ads you constantly got on YouTube these days. It was a long period of just being able to access all this different content, and I think there was a lot less concern about copyright then as well, so you could access a lot more things even compared to these days. So you could just access all sorts of different political and economic stuff. Maybe not the most exciting thing, but I think it was around the same time as well. I set up my own kind of app development company, was doing a whole bunch of nerdy things there, and then had to pay taxes on all that income. That was a pain. It wasn't that much income. It was kind of like a McDonald's level salary income. It wasn't millions and millions of dollars, but it kind of, it was my first introduction to what it meant to have anything to do with business.
How did that come about?
It came about, I developed something for way too much depth for a school assignment, where I created an application that could email you when someone replied to you on Twitter. This was in the very early days of Twitter, before Twitter had this functionality. And then subsequently we made an app that could send you a push notification when someone replied to you on Twitter, again before Twitter introduced that functionality. And I work with a few people I basically met on Twitter, and who were kind of a similar age. I think they were 14 or 15 around the time, who we thought it would be cool to set that up because Apple had just announced this functionality. And then we created a few other apps as well that then subsequently sold this little company to a British app startup. It wasn't a particularly big or successful enterprise, but it was kind of interesting and fun.
Yeah, but it's just the fact that you were doing that. Like, I didn't even know Twitter was a thing then as well.
Yeah, I remember Twitter felt like a lot less kind of aggressive, a lot less political, a lot more people just kind of saying random things, exploring ideas. The ability to kind of build like a kind of little social network of people around Twitter that I had at the time. If my parents are paying much attention, they're probably quite suspicious of who were all these internet friends. But it all seemed relatively innocent at that point. And there were a lot of other people kind of a similar age who, or a little bit older, who were kind of interested in all these kind of things.
So were friends in school interested in similar stuff? I'm just like, how did you even just go? Because I assume I went to a school like around the corner from you, and I'm the same age. But I'm like, it was MSN, MySpace, and then Facebook came. Like, I don't think I'd heard of Twitter until I moved to the US and I was 22.
Yeah, I don't think.
And I don't know none of my friends, like, I don't know anyone from Australia who uses Twitter.
I mean, I did also have MySpace and Facebook and all the other apps as well. But yeah, I don't think I knew anyone at school who was on Twitter, or maybe like one or two other people at school who were on Twitter. It wasn't like, I think you're right. It was not a particularly popular platform. I mean, I don't think Twitter even to these days is not a particular popular platform unless you do something very specific in kind of tech or politics or maybe journalism. The main thing, it's certainly bigger in the UK and the US, and in Australia I don't think it's ever been as major a platform. Obviously it lives freely in the minds of a lot of people as a very important social media network, but comparatively speaking it's actually, I think, much smaller than Facebook or TikTok or any kind of video game social platform that you might think of.
So what was your dad's business?
So he made software for accountants, so kind of helping people manage their kind of company management as well, and registration issues, as well as superannuation management for people who manage their own super. And
would he come home and then talk about what it's like running a business or how the government impact, and like wanted you to be interested, or you were just hearing things and picking up on it?
I think it was probably a bit of a mixture of both. Like he'd talk about things that were going on with his business and little specific bits and pieces and issues that were going on with staff and just kind of the general rigmarole of trying to operate a business. And it would certainly come up as an issue, in particular things like tax or labour regulations as being an issue that could cause a lot of problems when you're trying to manage a kind of smaller to medium-sized business.
And so were they encouraging of you starting your own business?
Not particularly encouraging or like pushy or anything. I kind of, they didn't tell me to. I kind of just did it of my own accord, and they were supportive and helpful at times as well. But there was no sense that that's what they expected me or wanted me to do. My older brother also ended up kind of starting a few small digital tech businesses. So maybe for me it was kind of quite normal thing to do rather than something that was quite weird and abnormal, which I suppose in retrospect is a lot weirder and more abnormal than a lot of other people growing up at that time.
No, it's not. I just think it's really good because, I don't know, Melbourne just doesn't seem to be like the most entrepreneurial place, especially for young, I just haven't really heard a story. Definitely there's a lot of stories of people like working hard, people get jobs, I feel like that's the normal thing, to get a job at 15 and work hard. But to make something yourself, that's like really cool.
Yeah, it's certainly not necessarily that common anyway, you could say. But at the same time, I remember we did an interesting survey back when I was at the IPA in Melbourne, where we asked, was a particular survey, I think, of 18 to 24-year-olds, asking them about a whole bunch of different attitudes. One of the questions, which was quite stunning, was, would you ever like to start up your own business someday? I think something like 60% of people expressed an interest in starting up their own business, which I think in some respects would be quite a big generational change, because I think you're right that the way people have operated in recent history, at least, is this idea that you get a degree after school and then you go work for some large kind of corporate company and build your career along that path. It's much less common to think of kind of wanting to start your own business or wanting to be your own boss. But there does seem to be a lot of appeal amongst younger people not to have to work in that kind of corporate environment, to have a lot more kind of choice about their career and therefore wanting to start a business. How often that actually translates into starting a business. I mean, in some respects, it's much easier just to start some little hobby thing when you're still in school than it is to commit yourself full time to a business when you're dependent on an income and you have to pay its own way. Those are two very different things.
Mm-hmm. And so, what did you learn from that experience?
It's a lot of work. I mean, eventually we stopped doing it just because I wanted to focus on doing well in school and in my final year of school, finishing VCE and getting into university. And I suppose I was attracted back to the more traditional path, and it wasn't enough to sustain a career on that path alone. I also was interested in politics and ended up studying politics rather than kind of sticking down the technology line. I learned a bit about kind of communications and trying to sell a product. Learn a bit about how difficult it is to kind of be part of a team of people kind of with slightly different preferences and having different discussions and arguments and getting things done. Learn a bit of technical skills in helping to develop certain products. I was doing a lot of kind of website things that have been subsequently quite helpful and useful to understand and know when I've been involved in political things and digital communications. So that side of it learned quite a bit. Learned a bit about kind of journalism and journalists, and remember writing press releases for our app releases, and subsequently done a lot more work in press. So it definitely kind of started there on the app side of things.
And what did the money mean to you that you were making from it?
I mean, the money's nice. It's always nice to have a little bit more money. I mean, I just remember it wasn't a lot of money. As in, if we had worked at McDonald's on an hourly basis, we probably would have earned more money or just as much money. So in the end, it wasn't necessarily, we were hopeful that it could be something highly profitable, but it didn't end up being anything particularly profitable. It just ended up being something that was more of a learning experience and a valuable life experience rather than something that was going to set us up for our lives with, you read the stories about some kid who sold an app for millions of dollars to some US, venture capital firm or something, and obviously that's a rarity. It's not necessarily the norm. There's a long tail of unsuccessful or relatively financially unsuccessful efforts to build a business.
And that wasn't the motivator for you. It was just that you met these people on Twitter, you had a really cool idea, and you wanted to build something.
Yeah, I think it's both. It's always a bit of both, right? You have an idea that this will be a nice way we can sell our product because there's an app store, we can make a little bit of money, but also that there's something kind of fun and interesting to do, and see what we can do and see what we can build and create. And it's always there was always think back to something quite appealing about just being able to make something, just have something that's a product that's been created. Well, what I do these days in politics is a lot more. The product is ideas that are kind of like an opinion piece or something. It's not quite the same as having an app on your phone. You can say, I made that app, or I was a part of the team who made that app, and that does something interesting and cool and different.
Mm-hmm. Was the team... Okay, sorry, last question on this. I'm just so interested because this is not what I was doing when I was at school. Was the team also 14-year-olds?
Yeah. We were all in high school.
In Australia?
Yeah.
Okay.
They were both in Sydney and I was Melbourne, so we were putting remote working way before it became popular.
Are you still friends with them?
I think we might follow each other on Twitter, but we haven't spoken in years now.
Yeah. Okay, and then how did you? Because I found this article you wrote for the ABC when you're 17.
You found my first article,
and I just love it because it's about alcohol, and it's kind of saying, okay, this is an issue. There's people just drunk all over Melbourne. But
you're making Melbourne sound like a very trashy place.
But the government it's not the government's role to say what substances we can and can't have, which this is the whole conversation I had with Chris Snowden. I'm like, okay, so what about heroin? Like, when, but it's like, okay, it's not the government's place, but it's the role of the family to educate children, or maybe somehow in school, you know, a one-off thing in school being like, don't do drugs. Like, obviously everyone's like, okay, let's go and do drugs now. But it's like teaching it in terms of like the body and blah, blah, blah. So, but I'm just so interested, like, how you ended up writing that as a 17-year-old, or like how you became interested in these kind of things.
Yeah.
I guess the YouTube videos would have had it.
Yeah, I think I became interested in the ideas, as I was saying earlier, the ideas of people being kind of free to make their own choices in life, and not being over-encumbered by government intervention. And I think on the, you know, what Chris Snowden now calls lifestyle economics is an important element of that. It's your freedom to enjoy yourself in life and not be directed about what you can and cannot do. And I think around that time there'd been a bit of discourse in Australia about the alcopops and the alcopop tax, and these evil substances. Now, I think subsequently they worked out that putting a special tax on alcopops led people to buy bottles of vodka and bottles of soft drink because it would become cheaper. There was also a bit of concern that there was one study of the University of Sydney that said the alcopops tax led to an increase in drug use because people substituted in the margin away from alcopops because they were more expensive and did other harder substances. I don't think Margaret was necessarily as sophisticated at that point. I think you're right. It was a little bit more, well, people do act irresponsibly. Some people can get drunk. You know, that's not necessarily the best thing. There's like a negative externality. You know, if everyone all the time walking around Melbourne was absolutely intoxicated off their face, I don't think it would be particularly kind of welcoming or nice place to live. But at the same time, you're not going to be able to solve that kind of an issue through government intervention and trying to tell people how to live their lives. People are going to, you know, the classic lesson of prohibition is that people are ultimately still going to want to do certain behaviour, whether or not you do or don't allow them. You should, in one respect, respect people and the behaviour they want to do, and in the second respect, try to minimise the impact on others if there is some kind of negative impact. And I think that as a principle is certainly something that I suppose I began developing in an article like that. I mean, why did I write it? I think I was basically around that point. I got interested in politics and writing and wanted to get into being able to publish opinion pieces. And the ABC had an opinion site called The Drum that they would take external contributors for, and they accepted my piece and put it up on their website. I think around the same time I read a piece, I think it was in defence of private schooling or something along those lines, that got on the Age's online website. And there were a few things I was trying to pitch a bunch of different things just to see whether or not I could get more involved in writing, because it's something I wanted to do.
Interesting. On that, has your thinking kind of evolved a lot from that point? Or are you like, yeah, these are my values and that's it?
I think in terms of my broad principles are similar. I think my kind of, as you explore the world more and learn more, your ideas become kind of more nuanced and more complex. So I think my understanding of issues is definitely changed. I'm probably not as dogmatic about some things as I might have been in the past.
What did you used to be dogmatic about?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I would have probably been more dogmatic about, when you're at university, you can kind of go to a more of an extreme. You can be like, well, I don't think there should be any regulation of all these things. And now I'm like, well, I kind of appreciate that you might, there might be some role for the state, in certain areas where I don't necessarily think I would have appreciated them in the past. Like, for example, when COVID came, I was probably more sympathetic to some level of restrictions than I can ever imagine me being when I grew up. And it took kind of a slightly less kind of extreme libertarian perspective despite my principles, because of appreciating the kind of negative impacts and negative externalities on others. Probably taking something like the environment more serious as an issue, that you do have this very real issue again of negative externalities from production causing climate change. Not to say that climate change says that people shouldn't generally be free to make their own decisions, or that climate change even says that a market system doesn't deliver prosperity. It just says there are certain issues that sometimes require some level of intervention. In the case of climate change, I'd use something like a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme just to ensure that people take into account of the cost of climate change. So I think being more kind of open and accepting of some kind of interventions when there are specific issues, and then trying to think about what the least intrusive way to do that on people's liberty on the kind of a well-functioning market system is something that I probably think about a lot more these days than I might have 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Because, I'm thinking about even with that alcohol argument, this, I guess, because there's been, like the episode I'm going to publish later this week is someone who grew up with parents who are alcoholics, and which usually actually, well, I don't know, but then that meant he didn't go anywhere near that way. But my point is, if you leave stuff to the family, it's like, how do you solve something in that situation where the parents are the ones struggling? It's like, what's the libertarian answer to that?
What is a libertarian argument to bad parenting? I mean, it's a good question.
Not bad parenting, like they're struggling.
Yeah.
There's some, it's like come from generation, it's like the way they grew up, like someone was abused by their parent or whatever. And then, like, how can we as a society help? I'm just very solutions focused. So I just see the damage of alcohol in society, but I'm like, how do we, and I agree, like, I don't think that letting the government control stuff, you just have to look at countries where the government has rules that you don't like. For example, Qatar, and then it's like, it's so funny how people can look at that and be like, wow, that's so bad how they treat their people, but then realise, like, if you give control to a government here, maybe they could just make a decision that you don't like either.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like a general good reason to not give a ton of power to the government. But it's like, but then how do you solve some of these problems?
Yeah, I mean, in the first instance, I'd be skeptical about the ability to use the state to solve problems. Like, I think part of the issue is in public debate and discourse often it says, and you're completely right, we have this serious issue. There are parents who are alcoholics who do terrible things to their children. And therefore someone will say, well, therefore what you need to do is, limit people's access to alcohol. Now, quite frankly, if someone's an alcoholic, it's very hard to limit access to them. Their willingness to pay for the alcohol is actually very high. Chris and I can talk about this a lot more, but it's why, minimum pricing in Scotland, for example, hasn't worked very effectively. But you come up with these very, nudgy, interventionist kind of solutions to these problems that are far deeper and kind of culturally ingrained issues. And I don't think we have a discourse or way of talking about some of these issues, other than to say that talking about them, I think, is probably actually a key part of it, as well as having an idea of what the kind of interventions are you can do is probably a very localized level, so within the communities that are going to try to address these issues. Now, at one extreme, there might be a justifiable case here where parents are actually abusing their children, and there is clear role for state to occasionally remove children from an abusive household. But I think what you're talking about here is probably more nuanced cases where there isn't necessarily, it's an absolute extreme to take a child away from their parents, and you don't want to do that very often. So what do you do in the in-between cases to try to kind of improve people's individual behaviour? I mean, to some extent, you probably have to accept that the price of liberty is that people will sometimes behave badly, and they'll even sometimes behave badly to each other. But the cost of kind of the authoritarianism required to prevent that would be too high. And therefore, you accept a kind of margin of error here. And you say you can't, practically speaking, you can't solve every problem. And if you try to, you're just going to cause other problems. So, for example, you could put cameras in everyone's houses to track them constantly as, kind of like a dystopian response to family abuse situation or domestic abuse situations. But of course, we would say to that, rightfully so, that's a revolting, disgusting idea to lose our privacy and our freedom accordingly. So therefore, you have to think about what the other things you can do. So you ensure you have a good criminal justice system to ensure that when people do kind of abuse each other or act inappropriately, that there's some kind of response there. You try to kind of move cultural norms. So, one of the interesting ones in alcohol is that younger people are drinking a lot less. Like people aged 18 to 25 these days are drinking substantially less than we drank when we were younger, and there seems to be like a bit of a shift in the culture of that there. And I don't think that's necessarily because of government programs or anything. I think there's just something in the ether out there, and a lot of these things are kind of cultural phenomenons and cultural discussions rather than things that can be fixed with the regulation and state intervention. So I kind of try to thinking about those kind of social issues. I don't say I have a solution to them. I by no means know what the right idea is. But I think part of the process is trying to discover what that is and being a little bit more skeptical than people usually are about saying, well, the government just needs to fix this. And it's like, well, if the government could just fix it, the government would have just fixed it. If things were easily solvable, and there's this idea in public policy called wicked problems, things that are just really difficult problems, Indigenous Australian disparities, for example, and health issues in the Northern Territory. That's a really, it's a wicked problem. Like nobody has a perfect answer to a perfect solution to it. And a lot of the interventions that are being tried to fix those problems have caused, as I've said, other problems that are quite authoritarian in nature. And therefore, there's a I suppose a need just to kind of step back and say, well, these things aren't necessarily easily solvable, and just saying that the government should do something to it isn't going to fix it.
Well, then I guess that's where we come to the importance of free speech and open discussion, being able to talk about things to then figure out what the solution is. Because that the government, they're like spying on you in your home, that comes back to the same problem of who decides, like who's the person watching the footage deciding what's the right way. And that's kind of totally against the free to choose. But I think the answer is education, which is and that's what I think young people are realising, like on the alcohol point, but maybe on a lot of other things that are harmful. Like if you let people figure stuff out themselves, they realise like, actually, it doesn't feel good to like abuse this, being hungover or something doesn't feel good. And then maybe or like, I like being healthy and like eating well, rather than, the government telling you this is what to eat. It's like, if you just figure out, oh wait, when I eat vegetables, like I feel better than if I eat Maccas every day. But then I think it's like stigma as well. You need to know that it's okay to not drink if you don't want to.
Yeah. I mean, I'd probably be more skeptical of like formal educational tools to try to solve these problems than I might have been in that. I honestly can't remember exactly what I wrote in that piece. I think I did say something slightly naive, is like, if only schools could tell kids, not to drink alcohol. I'm like, well, obviously, if you tell a kid not to drink alcohol, there's nothing that, particularly in a tacky way, there's nothing you're going to make them want to do more than drink alcohol. But I think there's something about like broader kind of cultural movements, which is, I suppose, education or understanding of the world that changes, and that's probably what shifted. There's something about just kind of the behaviour of your peers as everyone's influenced by all sorts of different things. There's probably the explanatory factor. Everyone, well, at least when I was 18, 19, 20, I don't think I can imagine really anyone trying to say, let's do something social and let's not drink. Like that just like there was no social activity that would behave or form that way. Well, I assume it's just a lot more common these days for young people to socialise amongst each other without drinking alcohol, and therefore if no one's drinking alcohol, you're not going to drink alcohol, and therefore your alcohol consumption is less, and it's just kind of like a change in the kind of norm and the behaviour is, rather than kind of a top-down educational thing. Because I think often when people say, oh, if only we'll just we just need to add this to the educational curriculum, I mean, how much does anyone really remember from school? How much are they likely to follow what they're told at some seminar for 30 minutes? Maybe some of it's good and important, but like I'd be a bit skeptical. I think it's more those kind of cultural factors and changing in behaviour.
And because that can quickly again go into brainwashing. Like, who chooses the curriculum? Why is this being put there? Is it some evangelist thing? But I think that's why it again comes back to encouraging people to learn themselves and think critically about things, and teaching, like within science. This is, I think, the point you made with this. Sorry,
maybe I am more consistent here. Yeah.
But you're saying just telling people don't drink is never going to work. But in science, being like, this is how alcohol affects, but importantly, not doing it in a brainwashing way, being like, choose to do whatever you want, but by the way, like, this is, it's. I
don't know if you remember. We definitely had a kind of neo-Puritan like show at school I can remember where they had like it was using like characters to try to do a show about like, I can't remember if it was about sex or drugs or alcohol or some mixture of all three. And I just remember just finding it like truly hilarious in the wrong way, where this is like so clearly like propagandizing us. Or like the one episode, I also have this like distinct memory of like one like sex ed thing where they split up the men and the girls, and they showed the men how to put like condoms onto a banana or something ridiculous like that. And I'm like, I guess this is teaching people good kind of sexual behavior. I guess, I don't know. This just feels very like manufactured and fake. As a result of like, it's kind of almost like a box ticking exercise, and those kind of educational things. I don't know. Maybe I guess I remember it, but I don't think it really stopped me from drinking. And I'm not really sure I learned how to put on a condom as a result of that, but maybe I did.
Yeah, I guess it's the learning more in the way of like, I don't know if you know Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep, and it's like just explain like the facts around, okay, if you're this sleep deprived, this is what happens to your body. It also has stuff in there about alcohol and memory. So for people to decide for themselves, like, hang on, I don't want to fuck up my exam that I've studied for because by like sleep deprivation or alcohol or something, so I'm choosing for myself to make this decision. I think that's way more empowering for people.
Yeah, I think there's also kind of a liberal instinct to have, which is to say, okay, give people information they want, but sometimes people are going to make bad decisions, and in a free society, we have to be free to make decisions that are not necessarily, objectively in our own interest. And I think there's an important part here that the third party doesn't have the capacity to decide what is good for you. And that as much as you might want to grab someone and just be like, stop being so stupid, why are you doing that with your life? I think the essential part of being able to have our own freedom is the freedom to not necessarily do things that are appropriate, good and smart, and that in some respect we need to be accepting of the fact that other people don't necessarily always do things that are good and smart and appropriate. That people buy lottery tickets, for example, which are like rationally ridiculous investment. The likelihood of return is like very, very, very low, and yet people do it. They get some kind of joy out of it. The kind of fact that they might be able to this week, get the 100 million jackpot or whatever, and there's clearly something there that's a reason why people still want to buy lottery tickets, and that we don't ban the lottery even though we know the odds are very terrible and rationally you shouldn't do it.
But I guess if people know that's a game, like, why not join in a game? It's like a raffle, like, oh, maybe I could win.
Well, indeed, but you could make an argument to say, well, some people are very low income. In fact, lottery users typically are lower income, that they're really getting duped by the system, that they don't have proper knowledge about the odds, and they think the chances of winning are far higher than they really are, and therefore the lottery is harmful to people. And I think there's probably a decent argument to say everything I've just said is true, but it doesn't necessarily then justify banning it altogether. Or do you accept that some people are going to make, other people are going to make decisions that aren't necessarily in their own interest, and your version of their own interest, and that their own interest might be, as you've said, it's a game, it's something fun. I don't really think about the odds. Most people don't really think about odds very much, and people don't tend to have a statistical mind. Does it really matter?
So how would you think about having regulation that says the lottery has to put on chance of winning? For like investment products, you have to put on, you might lose money by buying these shares. So they then have to put on the odds.
Yeah, I think it would ruin some of the fun if people were constantly seeing the odds prominently. I'm sure there's a way, and I haven't bought a lottery ticket in a very long time. I'm sure there's probably a way to see the chances of victory somewhere. If that's not necessarily prominently displayed, I think that's probably fine. I'm not sure. It would seem to ruin the lottery if people had like a better statistical understanding of it. Like, as you've said, part of the fun part of the game is that you're not really thinking about those statistical chances. You're thinking about something else.
So what are the main like core values that now you live by?
Live by or I think should be central to politics? Or a bit of both?
A bit of both.
Yeah. In terms of in terms of what I think drives political philosophy is definitely the idea of freedom and people being free to kind of live their own lives as they see fit. Generally, a sense of kind of what would make up a kind of prosperous society and ensuring that people are able to prosper. So I guess prosperity and freedom are kind of the main things I focus on politically. It's more individual level, kind of thinking about what conceptually is the good life and taking opportunities and trying to ensure that we in our limited time we have on this grand planet, that we kind of think positively and optimistically and try to grasp everything we can ahead of us, which I suppose is interrelated to my political philosophy as a kind of a bit more of a political and economic optimist than you often hear in debates these days. I generally think things are getting better, and the world is not a terrible place, and that although there are terrible things that happen and there are problems that need to be solved, we're generally in a good kind of trajectory for humanity, and the goal is to keep us on that trajectory where things continue to get better by leaving people as free as possible to create the prosperity for society.
And how does that work? How does your version of like the most ideal society work with the people who are left behind? Like, how does the government support them?
Yeah, I mean, I'm favourable to some kind of safety net that ensures that people who are, kind of between opportunities, or people who do kind of struggle for one reason or another, are provided for and supported. Now, I quite like the metaphor that the problem with the safety net is that sometimes people get caught in the net. So you don't want people to be given so much kind of welfare support, state handouts, that there's no longer any sense of hard work, in encouraging people to be determined and fight through adversities and seek opportunities. You don't want to create a kind of docile society just through the welfare system where you have one set of people who are working hard and then you transfer money to the other half of society who are begrudgingly, they're probably going to be angry because they're not going to get as much as they want and not going to have as high living standards as those people who are working hard and dedicated. So I think as a broad society, there is a duty to have some kind of level of transfer and welfare state, but ensure that the safety net is just that, a safety net. It's not something that becomes the be-all and end-all of life. And you can think about that in more specific ways, making sure you have some kind of healthcare system, but still having no issue whatsoever with having also privatised healthcare at the same time, or having a really good education system, but not necessarily delivering that through the state, having Milton Friedman talked about a voucher system where more or less parents are given a whatever the value of public education is, and they can choose which school they go to, and therefore are able to ensure that their child gets the best possible education. So the welfare state having kind of a really important function in terms of enabling people to get educated, as well as ensuring some kind of safety net when things necessarily go right, but overall leaving people as free as possible to prosper in their own regard and create their own value and sense of purpose in their lives.
And how do you think about people who want to pursue something that benefits society but isn't necessarily rewarded by the market, like the arts, for example?
Well, I mean, the arts is often rewarded by the market, and there are many forms of art that are highly profitable and get a large amount of patronage. I very much encourage and have no objection whatsoever to philanthropy and charity as a way to fund the arts. So it's kind of like the traditional method of funding some of the greatest artists in human history had some kind of benefactor. And as a social norm, I think that's quite a positive and good one. I'm a little bit skeptical of kind of state funding of the art, just because I think that ends up kind of turning into a form of middle class welfare. It's effectively the popular arts don't really need to be funded. Popular television, like The Crown on Netflix, that doesn't need state funding. You don't really need state funding for musicals, at least on the West End, that have a high level of turnout. What you need state funding for are things like the opera, or some Shakespeare plays, or some regional productions. And if you need to state subsidise them, then there's probably not that much of demand or interest in them. And it kind of showing that it's not necessarily what people want to see or do. And if no one's willing to put their money behind it, either through a market transaction or through a donation, then I'm not sure that there's a big role of the state in outside of that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just thinking of some like struggling creatives I know who are. So I guess, but that it's like follow your purpose, but be aware that this is the society we live in and this is the best version of a society, because if you are under like a communist regime, like you're not going to be able to make any art, full stop.
That's in that kind of dystopian way. I mean, I'm not going to make a claim that we live in the best possible society and everything is perfect and there's no problems out there and artists just need to stop complaining. I mean, I would say if someone chooses to become an artist, and that the choice that they're most welcome to make and seek success doing that. But if you can't persuade other people to give you money as like a representation of you doing something valuable, then I don't know necessarily why you're entitled to other people's resources. Why should the money go to you and not to a struggling stay-at-home mother with 5 children who they need to support? It's all some people would say just do both, but it's all a question of priorities in terms of society. And the reason why first and foremost, market transactions, I think, are wrongly seen as unethical or immoral, or survival of the fittest, or profit is greed, or whatever that is, or greed is good. I think that's all kind of bogus. Well, all you're doing by selling a product on the market is showing to other people that you're creating something that is valuable to them, and profit is your reward of creating a valuable product. Steve Jobs and Apple profited immensely by creating innovative products through all sorts of different levels, be it creating the first really usable smartphone to modern cloud-based computing products that ensure my photos sync across lots of different places. There's all sorts of different things, and the fact that they're getting paid for that is a sign that they've created something that people want to buy and they want to sell. And every time the government steps in to try to kind of subsidize something that might be justified in some cases, but you've got to say, if the government, let's say, subsidizes a factory that's struggling because they can't compete with other producers of the same products, what they're effectively doing is rewarding someone for being effectively a failure to make a profit and to create something that people want to buy. And therefore, I think that should be minimised as much as possible, and that people should be required to seek their own profit and their own by selling a product that people want. And that's why I think kind of the market is quite an effective tool for allocating resources, because it is that democratic process where people go out and buy something that sends a signal that we should use the resources in our efforts towards that purpose. And if you can't get someone to do that, then unfortunately it might be terrible, but you probably need to do something else that people have a demand for, that people want you to do.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I was watching that GameStop documentary. It was on Netflix about that whole Reddit thing that happened a couple of years ago. And it's like the people versus the hedge funds. And this woman is talking about Toys R Us, how a hedge fund had like short position on that because it was going bankrupt. And she's like, Wall Street has like destroyed my happiness of like me going to Toys R Us and buying toys for my kids. But it's like, no, the business like they were going bankrupt because they weren't managing their bit, or they weren't innovating, or whatever, right? Like, it's not the hedge fund's fault. It's not like evil capitalism.
Yeah, hedge funds get a lot of slack. It's kind of, I once read an article in defense of hedge funds. There's this idea that hedge funds go in and they buy a company and they exploit it and they cut their staff and they do all these evil things, and then private equity. Sorry, hedge funds play games in the market. Sorry, you're a finance sector person than me. But like hedge fund.
Yeah, but people don't even know what the word. People just like, these things mean evil.
Yes, well, indeed. I mean, so hedge funds. Private equity, indeed, was what the article was trying to defend. But it's like, well, you've got this evil private equity people who do all these terrible things. It's like, well, they're coming into a business, they're taking up a business that's not necessarily performing to its full potential. They think that they can make a profit out of it by improving its efficiency internally. That might, in fact, mean some staff needs to get sacked. That's kind of very sad and unfortunate at a personal level for those individuals. And I think that's part of the reason why it is morally righteous to have a safety net to support people when they do lose their jobs for whatever reason they might lose it, be it foreign trade or be it efficiency gains and like profitability of a business, improve the business, ensure that basically everyone else can keep their job and the business can keep operating, and then they sell it on. And that's an important function that they're doing. And hedge funds, obviously, I'm far less of an expert than you're going to be on the kind of finance sector and what they're actually doing day to day, but they're obviously trying to deliver profits to people who invest money, and they're using financial tools and instruments to do that, and Toys R Us was one example of it.
Yeah. Well, I guess the problem is if people think the system only benefits high net worth people, as in a lot of the time people don't realise, like, we are the shareholders. A lot of these, and yeah, of course there are hedge funds that the regular people don't access, but a lot of products and companies, they're owned by pension funds who are looking after our money for our retirement. So I think this is this big issue that people think it's all like the evil rich people are controlling everything. And it's like, who are these evil rich people? Like, these are massive pension funds who literally their whole purpose is to look after us, the people, so the government doesn't look after us in retirement.
Yeah, I mean, it's that there was a poll relatively recently in the UK asking people whether or not they identified as kind of working or middle class. And I think this phenomenon is even more extreme in the UK than in Australia, where people with over £100,000 income, well above average, massively above average incomes by UK standards, something like 60% of them would identify as working class. So a lot of people who are kind of wealthier, financially successful, don't necessarily see themselves that way, and people have this perception there's always kind of like an ultra rich above them, who can actually somehow just be taxed enough to fund everything we want to fund. Now the truth of it is, if you do try to tax those billionaires, those people at top, they're the most mobile ones. You're going to probably end up scaring them away, and they'll end up leaving your country. Just kind of what happened in France under Hollande when he introduced like an 80% income tax rate on top earners. So there's that risk. Then if you actually want to tax people substantially, you basically have to tax middle income earners, because that's where people somewhere between the 30 to 80% of society around that point is where you're going to find a lot of income, and inevitably when the government needs more revenue, that's who they're going to have to go to. It's in the same sense. It's like there is not this. There are obviously like a small number of extremely wealthy billionaires who exist, but that's not where most of society's income or prosperity or wealth is. I think wealth is much more distributed than people realise.
And billionaires, their wealth doesn't come from an income. Like, they're not a lawyer who's receiving an income. Like, their wealth comes from owning something.
Yes,
owning
indeed.
like a massive piece of something, so that's taxed totally differently. And then, yeah, the more money you have, the more sophisticated like ways you can get around tax.
Of course, yeah. Which I think is a problem. I favour a much simpler tax system. So we tax people maybe at a lower rate, but with a lot less exemptions and ability to kind of play tax games. I mean, at the same time, it's quite interesting about who, if you look at the list of kind of biggest companies, billionaires, it does tend to be people who have created some kind of a product. Now, there are obviously some people on there because of family wealth, but Bill Gates did not have family wealth. Steve Jobs did not have family wealth. Jeff Bezos did not have family wealth to put him into the place of billionaires. They've kind of created a product or a group of businesses or something that's led them to be quite successful financially. That's the question is what they've got fair? It's kind of hard to determine what is exactly fair. Is Jeff Bezos' money fair? But it seems like Amazon is something that's quite extraordinary, quite positive for humanity, and therefore he's been rewarded for that. Or like Walmart, as the US example, is a massively profitable family that's come out of the Walmart company. And those people are extremely successful, extremely rich, but they've also created a product that has clearly been extremely popular in the fact that it's a very popular store in the US. So it's all those kind of things, like when you're assessing is something fair and reasonable. What would be unfair is if it was what economists would call rent-seeking, which is they've only been successful because effectively the state has forced other people to transfer money to them. And this is what you do tend to see in kind of a lot of authoritarian countries. Is Putin's wealth fair? Probably not. probably a bit suspicious that the guy who's been president of Russia for 20 years is a billionaire. He's probably done something dodgy in terms of transferring state resources to himself and his cronies. So, it's that sense of why you're a billionaire matters more than the fact of someone is being a billionaire in themselves.
Yeah. So, I don't know whether Amazon is good for society, but I think the point is it's like who...
well, if you think it is.
Or Walmart. But it's like, but who gets to decide? Why should I get to... It's like the market's decided that.
Yeah, do you buy things on Amazon?
I avoid it at all.
Avoid it? Why?
Well, because I'm just such a... I like supporting smaller businesses. I don't know, books, I buy a lot of books. Okay, but then I buy them from Waterstones, which is a big chain. But for some reason, I just refuse to buy it on Amazon. But that's like my freedom to choose.
You're most welcome to that. Yeah, and I think for most people, they quite, I absolutely love Amazon. And I appreciate that, it's not a perfect company and that there are a lot of people who work extremely hard, who are necessarily paid massive salaries in order to ensure that their logistics system is the best in the world. But I did notice with Royal Mail striking, anything coming with Royal Mail you basically can't get. Amazon's still doing next day delivery. At the start of COVID, wasn't quite next day delivery at one point, and some of it was delayed by 2 or 3 days. But when everyone was immediately trying to isolate, Amazon was a lifesaver for a lot of people in terms of being able to work from home or get toys for their kids or whatever else it may be. So I think Amazon provides an extraordinarily kind of positive function in a lot of people's lives. That said, though, some people do prefer to support local things. And the cost here is, people. I think this is an interesting point, which is people in the UK a lot complain about the fall of the high street and the fact that there's a lot of empty shops. The truth is, the reason there are empty shops is because people aren't shopping on the high street. The shops would still be there if Amazon was not providing people with the service that they wanted. And kind of individually might bemoan the fall of the high street, but collectively we've made a decision that the high street is not necessarily something which we think should have shops. We think it should be something else. And I think that's the difficulty with kind of the politics versus the economics, or what sometimes people say that the revealed and the stated choice. So you're relatively unique in the fact that you have a stated choice against Amazon and online retail, and therefore you buy locally, and that's revealed by your behaviour. But for a lot of people, what they'll say is, I really am sad about the fall down of the high street. I think it's terrible. It makes my local community feel a lot worse as a result of the fact that there's nothing going on my local high street. But in their revealed preference, they're just buying things online. So it's why you've got to be careful about people's talk is cheap kind of approach to politics.
I think going back to Bill Gates quickly, it should probably be pointed out that he had this access to he developed what he did. This is according to Malcolm Gladwell, who tells an entertaining story in Outliers. But it's like he had access to this computer. There was the chance to have access to that at that point in time. It's purely when he was born at the exact right time. But also it is the opportunities. So I guess that's the point in a free society. You want to make sure everyone has access to those kind of education opportunities. Some people will have better if you allow private education. Parents will choose to allocate more to education, and that's fine, I guess, but it's making sure that somehow there's a basic level of education. So
I think all for some kind of basic high standard quality level of education. On that Bill Gates example, I think it's an interesting one to unpack a bit, because Bill Gates would not have been the only person to have access to a computer. There would have been a lot of other people, yet there's only one.
No, it was this crazy thing where it was only universities had it's this special, without the new thing, and it was somehow because of this weird thing.
But what I'll say is that there would have been at least hundreds, maybe thousands of people, not millions, but Bill Gates would not have literally been the only person to have access to a computer, to a Super Frame computer. There were other Super Frame computers that existed.
He was the only high school kid. It was the only high school in the world that had access to a computer because the money. Anyway,
but there were other kids at the high school. It's supposed to be the only time. It's and clearly there were other over time. Obviously none of us could do what Bill Gates has done because he was born at a time where there weren't computers and he developed a company that made extraordinary software for computers and was, as a result, extremely successful. No one can replicate Bill Gates. But the question for me more is, as I think you're getting to there, is like maximizing the opportunity for as many people to be successful as they can possibly be. And I don't think, even in a million years, even if I was born at the same time as Bill Gates and I had access to that computer, I don't think I would have started Microsoft. And maybe a few other people would have, and then therefore Bill Gates is, you're not someone who necessarily should get a unique thing to them. And of course, there are other people who make computer software and other computer developers, and then you can say, well, they're all American because that's where the opportunity was at that point in time, and where the relative prosperity was, and therefore that's kind of what led to the kind of personal computer revolution starting out of the States. Now, I think you're right, that globally there would be a lot of untapped, what you can kind of be getting to is that globally there's a lot of untapped opportunity. There are still tens of millions of people, hundreds of million people in abject poverty who are never going to have the opportunity to succeed, and that is tragic and awful and terrible, and not something that you can sit around and say that therefore the world is perfect. I think that's a way in which the world isn't perfect. It's not enough people have those opportunities.
I think I'm more thinking about in the US because, there's just very different. For example, when I worked in New York in finance, I couldn't believe on the street the amount of diversity that's there. We just are much more homogenous in Australia, I guess. So that was like, wow, this is so cool, being exposed to this kind of diversity. And then inside my office, the company won most diverse employer award or whatever, and I was looking around, it was like every single person is not only white, male, straight, they're also all Jewish. It's like there is literally I'm like, where is the diversity here? But I think there's obviously issues within the country.
Interestingly, there is a bit of a tendency of minority groups to be very successful entrepreneurs because they're often locked out of traditional kind of corporate world. So classically, maybe not so much today because Jews aren't necessarily locked down the same way, but Jews were seen as great entrepreneurs in New York and in the US for a very long period of time and started a whole bunch of different companies. Why does LA dominated by kind of historically a set of kind of Jewish producers and film studio owners? And it's because that was an area that they could go to because they were locked out of the kind of East Coast power bases. So they went to the West Coast and set up this whole different world that then ultimately, you can say there's now a Jewish domination of that, but that happened for its kind of own interesting historical reason. And he says, I think you can see that again in Silicon Valley, where it's very, the tech companies are very non-white. They hire globally, aggressively, and they a lot of startup founders and disproportionately immigrants are non-white for that reason. So I think in traditional institutions you inevitably don't get that diversity, but in kind of newer worlds you do for that reason.
Actually, Malcolm Gladwell writes about that as well, about what's one of those big law firms, but basically it was one of the Jewish guys who set it up. It was because he could not get a job. They would not hire a Jewish person at these old school law firms that only hired WASPs, and then they ended up fully taking over. But have you been following that, which is terrifying about, I can't remember who, because obviously the Kanye thing, but then someone posted something that was it's scary how this anti-Semitism that's coming up, and then all the comments on that post were but explain why is everyone Jewish in Hollywood, why are all the wealthy, it was all these comments were just so, it's terrifying.
Yeah, I think there's almost an interesting case here where there's anti-Semitism is one of the kind of oldest historical hatreds, and you can delude yourself into thinking that it's not something that exists or something that still resonates with people, and therefore it's kind of not really talked about very much, or these issues aren't really discussed. And then you kind of micro communities, as you kind of say with Kanye, there's this absurd, ridiculous, kind of very old style anti-Semitic narrative that comes out, and you're where does that come from? Now, I don't think most people are anti-Semitic or have that kind of an instinct. But then part of the problem is that these things aren't really discussed. So it's like, I think there's a bit of a temptation if you look at the movie studio, Los Angeles kind of case study here, where people will just say it's inappropriate to talk about the fact that major movie studios that disproportionately have like a Jewish kind of founding story. And then if you don't talk about that, then people will be like, well, then why is it? What is the conspiracy here? Did the Jews run Hollywood as kind of it goes? It's like, well, the Jews aren't a collective. Some Jewish individuals have power positions in Hollywood. The reason why they have that is because of this historical phenomenon, and that's how the industry developed. Because they were willing to take this big risk in this new industry in the 20th century, and that's the reason why you get Hollywood of today. There isn't a Jewish conspiracy to only promote other Jewish people or something in the industry. There's no sense in which it's meaningfully controlled by the Jews, but we also at the same time it's disproportionately representative of. And you can kind of point to other examples of that historically where. Why do you get this kind of idea of Jews as the money takers and the money spinners? Well, you can say, well, it's not really true, but there are obviously some examples of it. The Rothschilds are successful bankers. It's like, well, why did Jews end up having that kind of role in the Middle Ages and medieval society? It was because Jews were... Christians weren't allowed to charge interest. Jews were, but Jews weren't allowed to have homes, or often weren't allowed to have property ownership. So instead, they had a lot of money and they were allowed to charge interest on it. So therefore, they became the bankers. It's kind of like these are the historical reasons why these things happen and these stereotypes develop. And this is where, going back to what you were saying earlier about the kind of discussion and debate is so important. Because I think when you dismiss the discussions, you get the conspiracy theorists, and you can breed the anti-Semitism. Ironically, I think the danger is when you try to ban certain things that you get more of it festering. The classic thing is, let's ban Holocaust now, as they've done in Germany. It's like, well, obviously nothing. There's a few things.
Ban Holocaust what?
Denial. So make it illegal to deny the existence of the Holocaust. It's like, is that really going to solve the problem of some people having in their head a bad idea? I think it's much better to try to have like a public and open debate. You don't want to. There's a question about platforming. You don't necessarily want to give David Icke a TV show on BBC One at a prime time every day, but it is occasionally important to have these debates and not to try to suppress them or ban them or prevent them or use the law and the kind of same principle to other forms of hatred or bad ideas or even bad behaviours, as we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, because these, it won't go away. It will just go underground, or it will just go on TikTok, or it will just become like Andrew Tate or whatever, having a massive following saying these things about.
Yeah. Also, I mean, not to say America is completely unique, but America is kind of uniquely crazy in some respects, which is you're probably always going to find almost a disproportionate number of Americans who believe something crazy, more so than you will in Australia, even though there are crazy people in Australia and in the UK. It's like you ask any question, it's like, do you think there are, the classic, is the queen a lizard? It's like you can always get 5% of people to say yes to that. There's always going to be like a proportion of people who believe something that's completely nuts. So you can't stop them. You can't stop them from believing something that is untrue and crazy. And you shouldn't try to outlaw it either. You shouldn't try to control what people's thoughts are. Yeah.
But then how would you think about something like Alex Jones and the Sandy Hook thing, and then Twitter? Oh, this Twitter thing I find so interesting, with the Elon being like, yeah, we're not going to ban anyone, but then it's like, okay, Alex Jones isn't on Twitter. And then obviously Elon like banning the journalists for sharing his whereabouts, and it kind of, it's just this interesting thing to observe. But then, where do you draw the line with, or is it more like, okay, people can say whatever, but there are consequences, like what happened because Alex Jones is like the Sandy Hook and then got the massive fine.
Yeah, I mean, so Alex Jones' case, I haven't looked into the specific specific reasoning particularly closely. I mean, there was effectively a defamation case where, and they were able to substantiate, and the key principle of defamation is if you tell a lie and then it causes some kind of meaningful damage. So Alex Jones told this lie, and then it led to this kind of harassment and abuse of these parents. So there was a very clear kind of legalistic thing. Now,
even though he didn't know it was a lot, like, he was genuinely, like, believed the conspiracy, I think.
Well, I'm sure he believed it, but you can't judge. I think it's difficult to judge whether or not someone genuinely believes something. But I'm kind of skeptical about defamation law, in the sense of, I think defamation law is often used by kind of the rich and famous in order to censor and prevent things being published about them and said about them. Some of them true, some of them false. But I'm not... Defamation law is one thing, it's got kind of like a bit of a long history to it. It's kind of like a specific legal remedy for someone doing something that causes actual harm. And when you can substantiate and prove that harm monetarily, and you kind of get the appropriate compensation for it. I think in terms of the broader free speech question, so in my mind, there's probably two lines to draw with free speech. One is free speech in the kind of more traditional sense, which is what is the role of the state in terms of limiting things you can say? And I would say the role of the state in limiting things you can say should be extremely limited, sympathetic to defamation some of the time, obviously like actual harassment and abuse of people. You don't have a right to go and kind of yell at someone in the street, just like obscenities repeatedly every single day. That is speech, but that is not exactly kind of like expressing an opinion. It's something kind of distinctive and different, and there's a long history of kind of those kind of laws. Beyond that, though, I think people should be generally, at least when it comes to law, free to kind of say things that are kind of aggressive and even confronting and offensive to each other. Now, that's one line for free speech. Another line for free speech is what we kind of allow on these major digital platforms. And I think it's not... Although, I'm kind of a free speech advocate when it comes to, broadly speaking, I appreciate that what Twitter might want to allow is not necessarily the same line of what the state should or shouldn't allow. Twitter might and might have a very good reason to create a platform that has a certain characteristics or a certain kind of sense of community about it. And in that process, they're going to set their speech limits at a different point. Obviously, they kind of legally obliged to remove anything that could be illegal, but they might, as a result of their policies, want to remove more things. And I think Elon was a bit naive and didn't understand that distinction very well, that you don't necessarily want to allow everything that is legal on your platform. You might actually say you don't want to allow certain things. That said, though, I don't think Elon has been... I think he's de facto accepted that point, but he hasn't been very consistent about it. So I think he temporarily removed some journalists who'd been kind of sharing somewhere where you could access Elon Jet. And he'd previously said, Elon Jet, the kind of Twitter account that tweeted the movements of his private jet, he'd previously said that he would allow that as a show of his dedication to free speech. He then decided to remove it. And that's kind of like, it feels like, and it appears to be, and it almost certainly is, just making rules on the fly that are in his own instincts and his own benefit. And I don't think that's I think he's the owner of the platform. He bought the platform. He can do that, but I don't think it's a particularly good way to operate a platform. And I think rightfully so, perhaps it's something that could ultimately really kill Twitter, is that sense of unfairness and inconsistency in the application of the rules. And in one sense, it was already a key criticism of Twitter. But previously, Twitter made every effort, or made a lot of effort, I should say, not to try to appear to be consistent. And I think as a result of the Twitter files, we're seeing they were under a lot of pressure from the state and from the FBI when it came to like the Hunter Biden story, and then they kind of acted inconsistently there. I think it is a bit inconsistent to start removing some posts and not removing other posts because of election interference, specific election interference rules. I think all that stuff is complete garbage. And in one sense, that was a bad way to run Twitter. Now Elon's kind of badly running Twitter in a different way by kind of playing his own little games about who he does and doesn't remove. And that sense that it's not very it's very difficult to be completely objective about any of these things and to decide what piece of content. I heard about a recent case where it was like a conference of moderators, like kind of platform moderators, and they were kind of given a policy and given a piece of speech, and they were asked, these are the people who kind of make the decisions. They were asked, do you think this should be allowed or not allowed under this policy? And there was massive amounts of disagreement. It's like 50-50 on each one or something, maybe 60-40. It's not necessarily clear what pieces of content violate what policies in what ways. And it's the same principle of, the courts often come to decide different decisions in different cases that might appear similarly inconsistent. And they do that at a much smaller scale. It's really hard on these platforms with like hundreds of millions of tweets every day. And there's like 500 million tweets every day or something, to try to work out what isn't within policies, and then to be consistent in your application of those policies. It's just a really difficult task. I think you've got to make an effort kind of like almost like a rule of law principle to be as consistent as you can, and Elon hasn't been very good at that.
Well, I think hopefully the lesson for everyone is that having one person in charge of anything and making rules like this.
Yeah, it's about governance, yeah. I mean, the Facebook's done something quite interesting, Meta's done something quite interesting, which is they set up a Supreme Court, an oversight board, where they've appointed the good and the great, kind of journalism and think tanks and civil liberty groups, and they've said, we want to be able to refer complex cases to you where we're not really sure what to do. And they've been operating for a little while now, I think for over a year. And they're quite, they're not at a legalistic standard. It's not kind of like the Supreme Court of the US level standard, but they will consider a case, they'll invite submissions, they'll write kind of a reasoned, logical response to it. They'll give recommendations to Facebook about how they should handle certain things. I think it's incumbent upon these organisations. Admittedly, they're already getting regulated, so they're quite extensively. I think that's raising a whole lot of other problems. But I think the organisations do have a responsibility in some way to try to figure these things out for the sake of their users, as well as to avoid kind of more authoritarian regulatory responses where you get some state regulator trying to control the way that they moderate, which is the way things are going in the EU and the UK.
Mm. Okay, can we quickly talk about your book?
Yes.
And then why you moved to London, and then where we're sitting now in this beautiful part of Westminster.
Woo. Where should we start?
Maybe the book came first, right?
Yes. So yeah, I wrote a book, Democracy in a Divided Australia, which was an effort to try to kind of come to grips with the rise of populism, very much inspired by what had been happening around Brexit and Trump, as well as some of the kind of new literature around that was developing, be it Hillbilly Elegy or the Road to Somewhere in the UK, David Goodhart's book, and try to apply some of that literature and that thinking to the Australian context. So it was very much kind of developing this idea that you've got a kind of new political divide in Australian politics that had been kind of emerging over the previous decades. And you had this phenomenon where kind of in the post-war era, politics was kind of pretty predictable across Western developed societies, where if you were middle class, in Australia's case Protestant, you tended to vote to the right, you voted for the Liberal Party, and if you're working class to the left, you're Catholic, and you voted to the left. And since the kind of rise of higher education, the fall of industrialism, move to a knowledge economy, we've seen kind of very much a rejigging of the political divides. And the argument in the book is we have those kind of old class-based divides, the kind of middle working class divide, but that's kind of now been overlapped by a new kind of cultural divide that takes its form of issues like immigration, national identity. Should we change the date of Australia Day? Should we allow more refugee arrivals into Australia? In the same way that they kind of fall onto other kind of cultural issues in the US context. And what you've seen as a result of that is a kind of real scrambling of the political map. So whilst inner city areas that used to be very basically Labour kind of working class dominated, they're now full of a lot of kind of progressive Labour Greens voices and voters, whilst in the kind of wealthy suburbs, again, used to be very Liberal dominated. You see also the rise of the Greens. More recently, we've seen in Australia the rise of the Teals, who are kind of more concerned about environmental issues. Now, I call that kind of that group of people inners. So you have kind of left inners, who are kind of the progressive, university educated left, and then you have right inners, who are kind of like the wealthy, university educated right, who are kind of competing in the inner city, but tend to be quite kind of culturally dominant. And kind of socially and culturally progressive. And then the argument goes, I have these other group, kind of the outers, who live in kind of middle to outer suburbia, regional Australia. They tend to be less likely to have higher education, more likely just to kind of have a school education or a trade. They tend to be kind of more culturally conservative, more nationalistic, more patriotic. They're probably greater in number than the inners. They tend to have a more positive view of kind of Australian history, Australian patriotism, be kind of more sceptical of illegal immigration and more concerns about boat arrivals, and they're kind of in a very different kind of cultural melee, a very different cultural section And they traditionally voted Labor, but as a kind of working class constituency, and a lot of them still do, particularly ones with trade education who have kind of a union movement connection. But there's a lot of others who have become more entrepreneurial, who might have, the kind of working class started their own business. In the UK, they call them white van man. They're someone who's doing their own thing, and they're kind of increasingly likely to vote Liberal or National Party in the Australian context. So yeah, we've got this kind of, I suppose, more complex political divide going on in Australian politics. It makes life a lot harder for the political parties. I think we see this in different ways at each election. Often Labor, I think, has struggled in recent history as a result of the fact that they were struggling to deal with the rise of the Greens in the kind of inner city constituencies, and then the kind of suburban side of things. In these marginal Liberal seats, Liberals are able to play a lot more to those kind of cultural questions. And Scott Morrison did quite well there. Tony Abbott did quite well there in terms of winning elections initially. Now it's flipped, and the Liberals are struggling with the same dynamic where they've lost a lot of inner city seats at the same time as losing the suburban seats. They don't really know who they're appealing to. Are they for the working class man in the outer suburbia, or are they for these traditional Liberal heartlands that are now going more progressive, more left in their disposition? So I wrote that book in about 2017-18. It was published at the end of 2018. I'd like to think it's been vindicated by subsequent events in terms of Australian politics. But it also, I suppose, then tries to explore some questions around what is the nature of power, the power dynamic this creates, and what the frustrations this creates. So in the inners that I was talking about, those progressives are disproportionately represented in elite industry, in business, in politics, in the civil service, in academia. And what does that result in terms of the way Australia is governed and what kind of policies are pursued? And then thinking about how you end up wanting to balance this new divide, as well as the kind of electoral consequences of it. What are the kind of policy consequences of it? How can you decentralise power a bit more? How do you deal with controversial issues? And I think there are perfect answers to any of those questions, but there's something I was trying to explore as well.
How do you how do you think about the political compass? Because it's probably, not just like left, right, but authoritarian, libertarian, and where you fit in with it. And then how do you think about that here in the political landscape? And then also, how do you deal with if people kind of might label you as like, oh, you're ultra right wing because you're talking about free markets, or how people have this confusion between liberal values and like right, quote unquote right wing, and how these it doesn't necessarily make sense.
I'm kind of right economically, libertarian, very libertarian socially. I personally think that's quite a consistent political philosophy. If you look at polls, it doesn't tend to be a particularly popular quadrant. Most people tend to be kind of left on economics and libertarian socially, or authoritarian socially, or combined with being right on economics. I think if people are always shocked, when the IEA will be, someone at the IEA will say something that's very pro-immigration, and they're like, wow, the IEA is such kind of a conservative think tank. It's like, well, the IEA in the Institute of Economic Affairs were not necessarily that conservative. There are some people a bit more conservative, some people a bit more libertarian, or tend to be quite free market leaning. So I think it's just appreciating that kind of politics is a little bit different and more complex in terms of the way we view it. You don't necessarily need to 100% agree with a party position. And in fact, again, this going back to some of the theme in the book, which is the parties were created in a particular political context, particularly class-based context, and there wasn't really that much social or cultural controversy. These things started to develop in the second half of the 20th century again, but the idea of having debates about, same-sex marriage would just been ridiculous. Everyone thought homosexuality was terrible and should be outlawed. That was really like 80% of the population in the middle half of the 20th century. So there wasn't really social issues in politics, and therefore there wasn't a need to go left-right on social issues. That developed a bit more later as these issues emerged and then became politicized subsequently by various groups. In the latter half of the 20th century. So you basically don't need to attach yourself to any of those particular labels. Maybe you do if you want to be in politics and in Parliament, but I think there can be a bit more variability in terms of people's views.
So how do you feel if someone criticises you or labels you in a way that you don't feel like matches what
I take it a bit like a stoic. I don't really care. I mean, obviously people, if you're making, public prognostications as I do, people are going to label you and say mean things about you all the time. Often much worse than saying, well, you're a conservative. I think in the scheme of, I don't really consider myself conservative, but in the scheme of things, there are much worse things that people tend to call me.
Like what?
Well, I mean, people are generally quite abusive on Twitter and in newspaper comment sections.
And does it affect you?
I've kind of learnt to live with it. I think at first it can be a bit confronting, particularly if you get the worst thing you can kind of bad for your mental health is you do a tweet that then gets picked up quite extensively by people who disagree with you. Particularly if it gets picked up by some kind of major public figure who has a big following and a big aggressive following. And then that will lead to kind of like a constant stream of abuse. As a result, you get kind of a pile-on effect and people hiding behind people who kind of, it's what people are saying about you aren't true. It isn't true about yourself. It's not necessarily representing your views. They wouldn't say it to you in person if they met you, but kind of on social media, there's just a bit of a temptation just to perform to the audience and to say what is perceived to be righteous and good.
And are they like personal attacks?
And they can be. And name calling. It's kind of juvenile. But I think it's important just to not turn off notifications on your phone. Mute. Twitter has a great mute feature, so you can just mute a tweet and then you stop seeing any of the replies to that tweet. So if you're getting someone piling onto you over a tweet, you just mute the tweet. Deleting, I think, is generally a bad idea because that would be suggesting you've done something wrong. It would be sending a signal that you had done something wrong or that you didn't believe what you had tweeted. And maybe you don't, but I think unless certainly are cases where you should do that and you should say I didn't mean to say that or that was a mistake and delete something, get rid of it. But if people are being just abusive, unnecessarily or for in a bad faith kind of way, just muting the tweet, just not seeing it is the best response to it, and not really worrying kind of too much about what people are saying about you online if you're going to be in the public domain or you're going to engage with Twitter extensively.
Have you ever felt like I shouldn't have said that, or I want to clarify?
Yeah, I mean, there was a case recently where I said I took a selfie of myself at a kind of union protest and then put that on Twitter, and then that got quote tweeted by the union, which then led to like a real stream of stuff from the supporters of that union. And then they went through these tweets of mine from like when I was 14 or 15 and started posting them back at me. Again, I was on Twitter way too early, as we established earlier. And I was like, I really wish I hadn't tweeted that when I was 15 or 16. They weren't that necessary. A few of them were political, but they were just like intentionally kind of misinterpreted or taken out of context. I'll say I didn't remember what the tweets were that I'd previously tweeted. I should have deleted all my previous tweets when I reached adulthood. And there's got to be like a button you can press and be like delete everything off the internet that I said before I was 20 or something, because I was quite a silly teenager. But it is what it is. You can't undo the past or control what you might have said or thought or done.
And that's so annoying. Like, can't we realise that people do stupid stuff when they're teenagers and we're allowed to
I think
make mistakes?
Surely we have to get more accepting of that fact. Surely as we get millennial politicians who grew up with the internet and were kind of active users of the internet when they were at university and when people had mobile phones that could take video, we're going to just have to accept the fact that politicians are human and normal, and therefore hopefully that as kind of a cultural phenomenon has become, I think it probably is becoming less and less interesting to say that this person when they were 17 did this or said that. It's like, I don't know, it feels like unless it's something truly terribly awfully monstrously bad, I think people probably have moved on a little bit at least, don't you?
I hope so. But so did that make you feel like I shouldn't have taken this photo? Like, does it ever make you feel like, oh, I can't be bothered posting this because I might get this backlash? Like, do you ever do stuff to kind of get that response or not?
Yeah, I mean, I should probably... And sometimes I just do it without necessarily thinking as much as I should. In that case, I probably was looking for the backlash. I didn't quite appreciate the extent of the backlash I was going to have.
What did you write?
I just wrote, like, just past this... Because I was getting on a train and there were people who were kind of picket line because it was a strike day. And I just said, haha, getting on a train, ignoring the strike or something. And I think it was clearly... to some extent trolling in my own regard. So therefore, I've got to take responsibility for the fact that people are going to, if I troll them, then they're going to troll me back. So I can't be unhappy about the consequences. Do I regret I just hadn't done it? Probably, yeah. It's like I didn't get that much out of it compared to the barrage of abuse I got in response to it. So it's like, was this really the kind of right cost-benefit analysis? But, I don't want to lean into that too strongly and regret everything I've ever said or done because I don't necessarily stand by it 100% or it wasn't my best tweet or whatever. It's like there's no point focusing that much on the past, is there?
And do you ever find yourself wanting to engage or like accessing some rage that's like in these arguments, or you're just like, I'm not engaging with these people, it's not worth it? Or usually, you don't want to be that kind of person who, like, are you able to understand, like, everyone's that's your values-free speech, so, like, people are allowed to disagree, and, like, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I could, if I really wanted to, could sue a lot of them for defamation or something, if I could be bothered, getting a lawyer, trying to identify who they are, and then take them through a court process, and it's like, well, I can't be bothered focusing and spending time or effort on that. Most of the time, I won't reply or engage. There's no point, is there? Just leave people to scream at you. So the best thing is a kind of like a comment section on an article you've written, and people will start necessarily disagreeing with you. Some often not giving any indication that they've read the article, and you're like, you can go in and comment and respond to them, but also you can just be like, yeah, well, mine's the article at the top, theirs is the comment at the bottom. I don't really need to spend my time and effort engaging with that one person. Sometimes, obviously you should, and you should read genuine good criticism. I think it's anti-intellectual just to kind of dismiss all criticism, but there's so much response that you can't possibly deal with it all. Like you can't necessarily, if someone takes the effort of emailing me or something, it's a bit different because relatively few people are ever going to bother emailing. And if they bring up some interesting points, it's obviously more likely to reply to that. But if it's like a comment or a tweet or something, it's like you can't spend your day, unless you probably shouldn't spend your day responding to all those. And I guess you would know that you spend your time, like this is literally your job to research these things. It's like you have an informed position. You're not just saying some random opinion to like annoy people. Yeah, I mean, even if it isn't an informed position, usually, and I won't say, sometimes Twitter's a bit different, obviously, to kind of a written out article. Twitter can sometimes just be like a thought that isn't necessarily well researched or thought out or developed idea. But usually if I write an article about something, I would have spent at least some time thinking about it and developing the idea. And therefore would hope that it would be of a higher standard and quality that I don't necessarily need to be defending myself constantly. Okay, I think we should wrap up because we're trying to get into this room.
We should wrap up.
And we've gone for an hour and a half. But last question, is there a book that's had the biggest impact on you?
I mean, going back to the start, I think Milton Friedman's Free to Choose probably had the biggest impact in terms of my political philosophy. In terms of thinking about politics, the way people understand the world, John Haidt's Righteous Mind is an excellent read in terms of just why people are inevitably probably not going to come to agree with each other and how we prioritize different values and have different priorities. And it's important to understand that not everyone necessarily wants the same thing or sees the world in the same way that you do.
Cool. Anything else you want to say? Where can people find you?
You can follow me on Twitter, that excellent platform, at Matthew Lesh. You can follow the IEA, Institute of Economic Affairs, who publish and promote a lot of my work through their website or our newsletter or Facebook page.
Amazing. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.